This is one of a series of good answers presentations, offering evidence to answer skeptical challenges to the Bible's accuracy. Today we look at the account of the Exodus from Egypt. Was it a real event, or only a legend, the product of a people's collective imagination? Much of the scholarly world will tell us it is just that. Here's Carol Myers, writing in the New Cambridge Bible Commentary for 2005. After more than a century of research, and the massive efforts of generations of archaeologists and Egyptologists, nothing has been recovered that relates directly to the account in Exodus of an Egyptian sojourn and escape, or of a large-scale migration through Sinai. Or, note this quote, summarizing the general opinion of historians. This sentiment is repeated again and again. If you are looking for evidence of Israelites in Egypt and the desert, you will find no evidence in archaeology. Or this from John Van Saters in the 2005 Encyclopedia of Religion. The quest for the historical Moses is a futile exercise. He now belongs only to legend. We might ask, though, what kind of evidence we could expect to find. First of all, would the Egyptians tell about the Exodus? Despite their habit of inscribing records of events on great monuments, we find that these always trumpet their successes. They never record their failures. Some battles that they actually lost are recorded as victories. And there was much about the Exodus they would prefer to forget. A Pharaoh ordering the slaughter of helpless Hebrew infants. A Hebrew named Moses, raised as a prince in the royal family, only to turn renegade. 10 plagues inflicted on the Egyptians by the God of Hebrew slaves. The weakness of a Pharaoh, refusing to let the slaves go, then agreeing to it, then refusing again in an agony of indecision. And the disaster at the Red Sea, with the loss of the Egyptian chariot host. No matter how much we uncover, we are not likely to find an Egyptian record of all that. But there are other kinds of evidence that we might find that tends to confirm the Exodus account. Where might we find it? In the Nile Delta, in the area called sometimes Goshen and sometimes Ramesses. Recall the account from Genesis 47. And Joseph situated his father and his brothers, and gave them possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Meanwhile the people of Israel settled in the region of Goshen in Egypt. There they acquired property, and they were fruitful, and their population grew rapidly. It was the best of the land then, and it seems that it still is. While most of Egypt is desert waste, the delta of the Nile is rich and fertile, as we can see today. We would also expect the Hebrews to have been fairly near to a palace of the pharaohs, since the Bible talks about repeated comings and goings. Note Exodus 5. Then the officers of the children of Israel came and cried out to Pharaoh, saying, Why are you dealing thus with your servants? Then, as they came out from Pharaoh, they met Moses and Aaron, who stood there to meet them. The Egyptians' capital cities of Thebes and Memphis were too far away for such ready access, but if we could find a palace in the eastern delta itself, that would fit the Genesis account well. We would also need to know when in history to look. The traditional date of the Exodus is 1446 BC, as we learn from 1 Kings 6:1. And it came to pass, in the 480th year after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. Historians generally agree that the 4th year of Solomon's reign was 966 BC. So now we have a simple math exercise. 480 years before that date would be 1446 BC, the date of the Exodus. Having that date permits us to add in a few other items to our timeline. Moses was about 80 at the time of the Exodus, as the Bible says, so his birth would be about 1526. If the Hebrews were in Egypt about 400 years, then Joseph's time there, first as slave and then as second to Pharaoh, would be in the 1800s. But we often hear of a different date for the Exodus, 1225 B.C. Here's John Barton's comment in the Oxford Bible Commentary. The date of the event is most often put at the end of the Bronze Age in the 13th century BCE. But some, for example, Bimson 1978, maintain the 15th century date suggested by the Bible's own chronology. There are reasons for that later date, but they're not very good ones. The first is that William F. Albright, often called the Dean of Biblical Archaeologists, held to it. He argued that there were no physical traces of the Hebrews in Egypt to fit the traditional date, and that Jericho, which should have been destroyed by Joshua's invasion in about 1400, was virtually uninhabited at that time. There are good answers to both of those objections. Check out Jericho and Joshua in this series. But Albright's reputation was so great that many accepted 1225 for the Exodus. Another argument against the traditional date was the Bible's claim that the Hebrews were forced to build store cities, one of which was named Ramesses. This led many to associate the event with the great pharaoh Ramesses II in the late 1200s. But Ramesses is a name that appears often in Egyptian history, and the Bible doesn't give us the name of the pharaoh of the Exodus anyway. A third reason for the later date is Cecil B. DeMille. When he made his film The Ten Commandments, he drew heavily from a novel called Prince of Egypt, and that book used the later date. And finally, there was the skepticism of so much of modern scholarship, which was unwilling to trust the biblical account anyway. It may also help to estimate when the Egyptians reduced the Hebrews to slavery. We can't know precisely, but it was some considerable time after Joseph, since we're told that a new king arose who knew not Joseph. It was likely shortly after the expulsion from Egypt of the Hyksos. These were a Semitic people, as the Hebrews were. Sometime in the 1800s B.C., they began drifting into the northern part of Egypt, and eventually became numerous and strong enough to take control of almost half the country. They even adopted some Egyptian customs, and called their ruler Pharaoh. In effect, for about 300 years, Egypt was two different countries. If the Hyksos were in control of the Nile Delta region in Joseph's time, it would help explain why their pharaoh might have looked kindly on a Hebrew. They were both of Semitic ancestry. Well, the Egyptians tried repeatedly to expel the Hyksos, and they were only able to do so by around 1550 B.C. under the pharaoh Ahmosis I. By the way, he was also called Ramesses, and once the Hyksos were finally gone, and the Egyptians controlled the delta again, they would likely have worried about the Hebrews. They were a foreign people, Semitic like the Hyksos, and had become numerous and prosperous. They might well have been seen as a threat. If so, then the late 1500s B.C. would be a good guess for when they were enslaved. That is, shortly before Moses was born. Well then, if we're going to find traces in Egypt's history to confirm the Bible account, we would need a royal palace in the Nile Delta, close to the Hebrews' location, and in the 1400s B.C. Problem: after all the years of digging in Egypt, no such palace was ever found. Until, that is, the 1990s, decades after Professor Albright, when Manfred BTech did just that at a place called Tel El Dab'a. Here's a map of the eastern branch of the Nile. What Dr. BTech found there was the ruins of an ancient city. At various times in history, it was called Avaris, Perinefer, or Ramesses. The city was situated ideally for trade purposes, since it could serve both seagoing trade, being on the eastern branch of the Nile, and the land-based caravan route, the so-called Way of the Philistines, which headed out from here around the eastern end of the Mediterranean to places like Canaan and Phoenicia. Who built this city? Well, recall Exodus 11:1. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses. In that ancient city, Professor BTech found the remains of a royal palace complex. 3 palaces, in fact, all built around 1525 BC, along with the city itself. But the curious thing is that after only about 100 years, the site was abandoned, around 1420 BC. Here's a reconstruction drawing of one of the palaces. Professor BTech found that they were decorated with elaborate frescoes. One showed the bull-leaping ritual that we know from the Minoan culture on the island of Crete. Not surprising, since we know there were trading connections between the Minoans and the Egyptians. The palace also was supplied with bathing facilities. As BTech says, it is apparent that each entrance to the palace passes a bathroom. A full bath must have been obligatory prior to entering the building. This handsome jug, appropriate for use in bathing, was found near one of these bathtubs. How does all this help with our search for the Exodus? Thanks to Professor BTech's work, we now have both a store city and a palace in the eastern Nile Delta, as the Bible text requires. And they were built at the right time, about 1525 BC, apparently by Hebrew slaves. This is, in fact, about the time that Moses would have been born, and in time for him to have been found by Pharaoh's daughter and taken into this palace. Then, mysteriously, all this was abandoned just about 100 years later. Professor BTech again. The palace district was probably abandoned after the reign of Amenhotep II, that is, Amenhotep II, 1453 to 1419 BC. The reason for the abandonment of this district, and presumably the entire city adjoining the district on the south, is an unsolved puzzle at this time. Its solution would be of the greatest importance to historians. You may guess from this that Professor BTech does not evaluate the evidence from the perspective of the Bible. He sees the abandonment as a puzzle, one he'd very much like to see solved. But if we consider the Bible's account, the puzzle has a simple solution. A Christian archaeologist, Dr. Bryant Wood, does see it that way. By correlating in time and space the events recorded in the book of Exodus with the findings, the reason for its abandonment becomes clear. The series of plagues that took place at Perinefer, or Ramesses, made it an unsuitable or undesirable place to live. In later generations, the bricks from the palaces were carried off for other construction projects, leaving the remains to decay over the ages. Fortunately, enough remained of the substructures to allow approximate reconstructions of the palaces where Moses roamed, lived, and confronted Pharaoh. So, what have we learned from this brief study? Professor BTech has given us, whether he realizes it or not, an important piece of evidence for the Exodus. We now know there was a store city with a palace complex in the Nile Delta at exactly the time the Bible's account requires. It would have been the home of Pharaoh's daughter when she drew the infant Moses out of the Nile and adopted him. 80 years later, it would have been the scene of Moses' challenges to Pharaoh and the 10 plagues that resulted. And from near here, the chariot battalions of the Egyptians would have ridden out, only to be drowned in the Red Sea. How conclusive is this? Do we have proof, then, that the Exodus really occurred? No, not proof. We do have evidence that supports, in good detail, what the Bible tells us about those events. It would, I think, be fair to say that it makes the historical account much more likely. After all, the palace is real. This is not the end of our search for the Exodus. Check out the second of these lectures for more. If you have questions or comments about this lecture, or any others in the Good Answers series, you may direct them to me, Dr. Jerry C. 4 at yahoo.com.